Greg had listed the title of the talk as Ellsworth, Toohey, Motives and Methods, and there's a logic to that, motives, in a sense, both preceding and setting the standards for any given method. But what I had submitted was Ellsworth, Toohey, Methods and Motives. And the only reason, other than nitpicking and a slight euphony of the cadence, that I prefer that is this, that I will begin from his methods and then move towards his motives. And I do that because Toohey is clearer and is clearer to the reader and clearer with himself about his methods than I think his motives. It has often been observed, or it has often been commented upon, that Rand observed that Toohey was in certain respects psychologically unfeasible as a real human being, that anyone engaged in the kind of destruction that he was couldn't be so self-aware of his own purposes, his own motives, his own methods. And that is, of course, I think, true. But one of the interesting things that came as I started to dig into this was that there are some things about which he's more clear, more self-aware than anybody in his position could reasonably be. And then there are some things that he's still more clear about it than he has any right to be, but not as pellucidly clear, not as unblinkingly self-honest. And what we'll find, I think, is that he is unrealistically, in some ways, honest about his methods. But I don't think that's fully the case with his motives. Or it is, but only so deep, as Rourke says of his pain. So what are Toohey's motives? What are his methods? God damn it. Anyway, I did that whole big thing, and I just, there you go. All right, anyway. Well, did anyone, how long am I in? 2 minutes in? I'm going to say 5. Okay. Oh, all right. Okay, so Toohey tells us in part 4, chapter 13, when he breaks down Keating, when he decides he doesn't feel like helping Peter's self-deception any longer. And when he perhaps just, well, for no one in particular, since he already knows it and since Peter won't understand, to make it an object lesson about the fact that he thoroughly owns this man's soul and reveals his sort of thing, he states a number of his different methods. And every one of the methods that he names has been illustrated thus far in the book. Does anyone recall some of the methods he mentions? Methods of what, you might ask? Methods of what?
Owning other souls.
Collecting souls. Correct. And control, yes, control, but especially to collect souls. And because the structure of his explanation is, you can't control somebody who thinks, you can't control someone with self-esteem, you can't control all these things. So here is how you break it down one way. Here is how you break it down another way, with the end being control, at least as he explains it, right? So how do you take over souls, or how do you make souls vulnerable to that? Yes?
Make people feel guilty?
Yes. So guilt is a major weapon. In Atlas Shrugged, Rand's later magnum opus, she distinguishes between mystics of the mind, mystics of muscle. The mystics of muscle are more like your Gus Webb, maybe Gordon Prescott types. You're coming kind of Marxists who just want to control bodies. Mystics of spirit, not mind, mystics of spirit are your traditional religionists who don't care about the physical world but want to control your soul. Now, Toohey doesn't actually naturally fit either category per se. We know in his intellectual development, Up until the age of 16, he had intended to be for the ministry and talks a lot about God and suffering and traditional religious things. Then he discovers socialism and he shifts. But what we find is that he is an equal opportunity destroyer in terms of guilt. I mention all this because one of the best places that he uses the power of guilt is with Hopton Stoddard. So Hopton Stoddard returns from his worldwide tour of various religious shrines. He, of course, has no capacity to evaluate Rourke's temple to the human spirit. Toohey quickly supplies him what his evaluation will be. And then Stoddard, of course, objects, but you promised me Rourke would be good. And what does Toohey say? I had every reason to expect that Rourke would be good. But something got in the way. What has the power to thwart all of that? And he tells Stoddard that God rejected your offering because you're not pure enough to offer a shrine. You have to start lower than that, like the home for subnormal children. You don't have a clean enough soul to offer God a temple. So there's Toohey perfectly comfortable with that kind of guilt for that kind of fear in that kind of man. But he can just as well appeal to a different kind of guilt with Catherine Halsey or with a kind of hidden guilt or shame in Peter Keating. In fact, part of what draws Peter to Toohey is that he acknowledges those hidden guilts and seems to approve. But it becomes a bond for them. What else?
I don't remember the exact words, but it's something along the lines of don't explicitly attack reason, but undermine it.
Yes. So what we find is this is ultimate or penultimate of these methods. So as he describes an irrational morality, a morality that will pit a person against himself or herself, such that self-esteem will become impossible, and also which will deprive people of happiness, depriving them of happiness being one of these methods, such as when, as a guidance counselor, he would tell young men not to go into the field of their choice, as he suggests to Catherine that she's not fit for college, etc. He then says, but of course, and then he says, if someone tells you to sacrifice, run. If somebody says, they want you should be happy, that person's your friend. So it stands to reason. He says, stands to reason, right? But here, reason is you're the destroyer's foe, since he says you can't control a mind, right? Now, then he says you don't directly attack reason. Then he says you never directly attack anything. And then he adds, although some have been remarkably successful directly attacking reason, and seems to be, it seems to think like, I wouldn't have expected Tertullian to get that far, but, God bless him, he did. And what he says is, and the way you do it, of course, is appealing to something higher, something that is more ineffable, right? You can call it instinct. You can call it divine inspiration. You can call it material dialectic, right? It doesn't really matter. People won't really push back on it. Now, why won't people really push back on it? This isn't actually a method he names, but it is a method that Rand would later name in one of her essays.
Floating abstract.
Well, that's not what I had in mind. Floating abstractions are an issue insofar as you do appeal to the fact that these people don't know what you're talking about. But why do people let you kind of get away with talking about things that they don't know, right? One of the ways this happens is argument from intimidation, right? So very frequently, when you reach a point at which the morality no longer makes any logical sense, part of what you say is, well, of course, by our individualistic language and logic, it doesn't make a lot of sense. To this higher thing, right, so and so. But of course, someone of honest intent and would say, well, what do you mean by that? Or tell me more. And at that moment, the most effective thing is either to kind of rest on the fact that you're an authority. And in fact, when Catherine Halsey says, not only is this not making me happy being a social worker, it's making me evil. and he thinks, stop thinking that your soul matters. And then he throws in some of this rigmarole about when you finally annihilate the self, then you'll enter the gates of heaven. She says, but who will enter? He laughs. He wasn't expecting a sharp point. But then he says, but it really was just a kind of crack. And then he starts talking about this higher stuff. And she's defenseless. First, she kind of just bows, yeah, Uncle Ellsworth. But if she had persisted, his next step would have simply been to toss it back to guilt, right? And to simply announce ahead of time that anybody who can't understand this can't understand it because they're no good. Right? Other methods, I don't want to spend too much time on it since the interest, some of the original stuff is more on the motives. Humor, of course, Toohey uses humor the way a terrorist throwing acid in someone's face uses the acid, but psychically. Toohey constantly is degrading things. He is making jokes about things that shouldn't be joked about. And when he says, I'm just kidding, and we can't be too serious about anything, to concede that to him, he points out to Keating, is to say that nothing really matters that much. And he says that kills the heroic in man's soul, right? If you hold nothing sacred, then you can't have anything sacred. One last one that I find particularly interesting and sort of eloquently demonstrated in the novel is that you attack ideals, but you don't attack ideals by saying that the great aren't, say, great. What you do is effectively like Gresham's law. That is, bad money drives out good. You dilute the meaning of greatness, right? So you declare no skin off your ass, no skin off your nose, nay, no skin off your ass, a great play, as Jules Fogler points out, because then anything could be. And then if anything could be, if this could be a great play, then what's the point of Ibsen? And when I haven't really learned to ever distinguish art, why would I go to the theater? It's all meaningless, and I've killed it. And who would want to go into the field of playwriting in a world where Ike the genius is celebrated, right? So that too is amongst the methods. But interestingly, some of the other methods that Toohey will mention along the way he points out that he's not a fly swatter. This is with respect to an article he writes about about Rourke. And that's true, he's not a fly swatter, but of course he doesn't actually think of Rourke as a fly. He thinks of Rourke as a much more existential threat. But one of the ways that Toohey also proceeds is by silences. What doesn't he talk about? Or what does he tell you is not really worth talking about, even though he has mentioned it, right? And that as well is part of it. Okay, so it's not the first time that he has revealed his methods in this way. In fact, there's an earlier point, this is around the time of the Stoddard Temple, where he is at first extremely happy that Dominique has come in to his office. And he's sort of reveling in finally having an audience to reveal it. And he even says, if you would say right now, at a certain point, Dominique becomes sick of it, disgusted, she's not talking, he's not getting from her the engagement he wants. And he says, well, what was I hoping you'd say? I was hoping you'd say that I'm like a murderer in some novel, right, who can't help but reveal, the brilliance of his crime. And I'd say, you're right. And then he says, I want an audience. And now I will return to that in a moment with the motives. Now, in his sort of big reveal to Keating, what Toohey acknowledges that he's been collecting souls. He says what he wants is power. That's the kind of goal behind it. And he talks about he wants his world of the future where every mind will be empty and helplessly trying to reflect every other empty mind, trying to reflect every other mind, and where there's simply no room for somebody like a Rourke to exist. If freaks continue to be born, by their 12th year, they'll implode. So, but here's a question. does he really care about the souls he's collecting? I mean, is that what deeply drives him? It is, in a sense, yeah, it's part of his method of, you might call it his means of survival. That is, to control other people through guilt is his métier. But is that what kind of pushes him, what he's really after? He says to Keating, in this world of the future where he will be one of these few, philosopher kings who pull all the levers, he says, sorry, give me a moment. He says, now, if you were a little more intelligent, like your ex-wife, this is him to Keating, for instance, you'd ask, what of us, the rulers? What of me, Ellsworth, Monckton, Toohey? And I'd say, yes, you're right. I'll achieve no more than you will. I have no purpose save to keep you contented, to lie, to flatter you, to praise you, to inflate your vanity, to make speeches about the people and the common good. Peter, my poor old friend, I'm the most selfless man you've ever known. I have less independence than you, whom I just forced to sell your soul. You've used people at least for the sake of what you could get from them for yourself. I want nothing for myself. I use people for the sake of what I can do to them. It's my only function and satisfaction. I have no private purpose. I want power. I want my world of the future. And then he goes on to describe it. Slavery to slavery, right? A circle of total equality, world of the future. Now, does he actually want that? Well, he knows he won't be happy, but he also knows nobody else will. But what sort of drives that? Is it that having souls, like, say, owning Peter's soul, is in some sense satisfying? He says it's my only function and satisfaction. He derives no satisfaction from Keating because Keating is not an audience. He says to Dominique, right, the problem with victims is they can't even acknowledge that they're victims. You're a victim who can see the artistry in it. And similarly, he wants to know what Rourke thinks of him, if only because if Rourke despises him, hates him, it will be some kind of acknowledgement. When he's fired from the Banner, he can't help, though it is in terrible taste, to go in to gloat to Gail Wine and to gloat in the following terms. You thought you had power, you amateur. He wants to be celebrated for being a great power seeker and controller. So there is a need for some kind of recognition. Additionally, is it really just, does he want the souls, or is there some other purpose even to collecting the souls? Because, of course, he knows he can't have Dominique's soul. Maybe he can't even have Winans' soul, much less Rourke's soul. The souls he can have, he also acknowledges, are basically non-souls anyway. Right? So here's one of the first souls he ever collects. It's Drippy Munn. So popular Willie Lovett gave a birthday party on the same day as Drippy Munn, son of a widowed seamstress, a whining boy whose nose was always running. Nobody accepted Drippy's invitation except the children who were never invited anywhere. Of those asked for both occasions, Ellsworth Toohey was the only one who snubbed Willie Lovett and went to Drippy Munn's party. A miserable affair from which he expected and received no pleasure. Willie Lovett's enemies howled and taunted Willie for months afterward about being passed up in favor of Drippy Munn. Now, we'll go on to hear that Drippy Munn begins to sort of cling to Ellsworth like a dog. Now, is it the devotion of Drippy Munn as a dog that Toohey wants? Or is it the howling and taunting of Willie Lovett that he wants? It's the destruction of Willie Lovett, not the devotion of Drippy Munn. Similarly, I'm probably getting close to time. Yeah, or no? Oh, all right. So I was going to ask two other questions. So about the world of the future, does he pull the strings? One of the senses in which he's selfless is he will get no benefit from this. Another one is, of course, he is entirely dependent on the thoughts in everybody else's heads. So it's not as if Toohey can control men with guilt by anything that he creates himself. As he points out repeatedly, he stands at the end of a long line from Plato and further, and it's to those same things that he must appeal to time and again, and he must flatter and help people self-deceive. And he actually says it disgusts him that Peter and others like him are so unhonest about their own malice. But an interesting thing is that, in a way, so that's one way in which Toohey is not perhaps as much as Winan, but in a way also self-deceived about what his power consists in. He's self-deceived in as much as Toohey thinks, I do, I pull things. Well, if Winan will give him a press, if Winan is sort of an absentee owner and lets them print anything and everything, if nobody's checking to see how many references to the gallant gallstone are happening and how many people of his kind is he putting in place, etc. But even more than that, he has no control over what he says he'll be pulling the levers with these different ideas that control man's soul, except he has no control over what those ideas are and where they come from and what he can say. So it's not really control at all any more than Winan controls what the mob thinks when he must feed them exactly what they want to hear, or what he thinks they want. So lastly, he says to Peter, when he says, why is he doing this to Rourke? What do you think I want? And Peter suggests, you want to kill him. And he says, no, I want him in prison. I want him where he has to obey, and they'll beat him with rubber hoses if he doesn't. And there's a sense in which, yes, ultimately Toohey wants a contradiction. He wants the obedience of an actual mind, because the obedience of a non-mind is trivial for him, and a real mind can't be obedient in that way, but at least force can cow it. But he says, I want him alive, and so on. But here, again, I think Toohey is not entirely clear about his own motives, because in his article that he writes that gets him fired, where he goes against the banner, he says at the end, basically he says, the public ought to be able to put him to death, and should. So quite publicly in this thing, he says he deserves to die, would that the public could put him to death. And various other things at other times seem to suggest that, in fact, there are moments where Toohey is like what Rand's eventual view of the mystic will be. That is, when he says he wants this world of the future, a world of stagnation, a world without room for the mind, what he really wants is death. He doesn't want to own souls that never were. He wants to kill men and destroy them who have souls, and then himself. Okay, that's what I have time for. Thanks.
One or two questions and then transition to the panel.
Do you think Ellsworth likes Gus and Lois?
He says he likes Gus, and there seems to be evidence that, in a way, he does. There's also sort of evidence that he doesn't like himself, but he at least wants a kind of recognition for his own, brilliance at what he does. But he says about Gus that, Gus at least is, honestly malicious, that is honestly vulgar, that Gus is just clear. We're just going to break things and take things and loot you, right? And dispenses with the rest. And how does Toohey respond to this? He kind of treats him like a younger generation, like a son almost, oh, sure, cutie pie, oh, yeah, chickadee. Right? He seems to be quite fond of him, and the more brutal and vulgarly violent Webb is, the more affectionate he seems to become. So I think he genuinely does like Webb's open destructiveness. I don't think he particularly likes Lois Cook. he points out when he's naming to Keating all the ways that if you raise up a mediocrity, you destroy it. He says, you raise up Lois Cook, you destroy literature. You raise up Ike, you destroy the theater. You raise up the British guy who's always writing stories about being drunk in some place. What's his name? You destroy journalism and so on. So, huh? No. Jules Fogler is the theater critic. Jules Fogler, he likes, or at least he respects, because Fogler understands exactly this principle, that if you can make anything a hit, nothing is, and that's control. Someone asked Fogler, why aren't you a member of the Council of American Writers? And he says, I don't join groups. I'm an individualist. And Toohey, of course, says, that's fine, Jules. You don't need to join. There's nothing I can teach you. Right? He sees Fogler as I imagine Fogler is one of these few other people that might be pulling the levers in the world, these other philosopher, king, priests.
So if he got his world, he'd have a few friends.
I don't think he has any friends. I don't think.
A little bit of companionship.
So even Fogler. So there is a time of relaxation when the intellectuals in Toohey's right circles are gathered in Lois Cook's house, and then Keating comes in, and they kind of are delighted, like playing with him like cats surrounding a mouse, right? And taking turns putting him in their mouths, And there's a certain camaraderie, but it's the camaraderie of sharing a dirty secret. But I don't think that, so let me put it this way. There are people that Toohey can get an audience from and people he can't, and people sort of he approves of formally along his lines, but also ones he doesn't. But I don't think he gets pleasure from anything. I think he gets brief, kind of malicious feelings of, ooh, I stuck it to that person. But it seems that like he doesn't enjoy this. Who's the person he's most desperate in the novel to talk to? Dominique, and then there's one moment where he's really eager to talk to Rourke, and he's really downcast that Rourke doesn't even think of him. So that's both who he wants and needs to destroy, and the only person that he's a little too self-aware that they have value, right? Yeah.
Can you contrast the two different kinds of power lust that's shown in the novel? One is that of Toohey, the other is Wynand. And just another follow-up to that.
There are two kinds of power lust I think we see in Wynand, or at least one can distinguish two aspects of his power lust. So one part is that he wants to control things, and he thinks he'll have that through money, and he thinks he'll have that through influence, something that gets into every house like bread and so on. And you can see that as somebody who thinks that in the world, integrity can't win, but he can at least have control. If people are just pushing each other around, at least I'll be at the top of the hill. But then there's the power lust he seeks specifically when he goes after men of integrity and tries to drive them to the point at which they will break. And then to say that they break means they then become alcoholics, drug addicts, suicides, right? And that, I think, is a different kind of lust. In the sense, both are responses to fear, but in particular, it seems the same fear, but perhaps in a more direct way. When he goes after somebody like Dwight Carson, what he's afraid of is that he's wrong, that there can be such a thing as integrity, which is to say what he hates or fears is a rebuke to himself and all of his compromise. And the power he lusts for is the power to break those men, right? And I think that's a little bit different and more kind of directly nihilistic than just the sort of power to control things, to not be pushed around, to have influence. Now, it never occurs to him, right, that the same power that he wields, he could use to shield people of integrity from any kind of incident that might cost them their integrity. That is, he could, and at one point he throws some work to, or buys up some stuff from Stephen Mallory. He could just patronize him for the rest of his days, and Mallory would never have to compromise, right? He doesn't. It's curious why he doesn't try to break Mallory either. But but you see that. So I think that Winan in those moments of attacking men of integrity, that is the same motive of or degree of kind of powerlessness that Toohey has with respect to Rourke. I need to kill this person because this person is death to me. This person is the rebuke of my own abnegation of the responsibility to be aware of reality.
Speaking of the nihilism that you mentioned, is that the reason why, let's say, in a strange way, Toohey and Dominique, they are both trying to do the same types of things for different reasons? But they both have, one has a malevolent universe viewpoint, the other one is more destruction or...
They are allies of, I'll quickly end this so we can go to the panel. They are allies of convenience, though Toohey thinks of it as a bit more. So he refers to Dominique as his student, and I must not have been a good teacher if you hadn't learned something. They are in different ways trying to destroy or prevent from ever getting off the ground the career of Howard Rourke, and using Peter Keating as a chess piece to do so. But Toohey is actually both of them, in a way, are mistaken about the other's motives. I don't think Dominique fully grasps the depth of Toohey's horrendousness. I think she loathes him, but I don't think she thinks he's important in a way that the novel kind of suggests he is. Toohey thinks that she just loves Rourke and was scorned by him. One of the few things that Toohey gets totally wrong is understanding Dominique's motivation with respect to Rourke. Another thing he gets totally wrong is when he refers to Rourke and Winan, or half totally wrong, half right. That when Rourke and Winan meet, that it'll be like the bloodiest wars are civil wars. True that the bloodiest wars will be civil wars and internecine fightings of things. True that Rourke and Winan are in some ways incredibly close. Wrong that they are on the same side and they are just two different sects. But that is the extent to which Toohey can't actually conceive. He senses what Rourke is. He knows that Rourke is what he is not and can never be. But he also doesn't really understand, I think, what he is. Because he knows Rourke doesn't want power, right? Anyway.